Hey, what's happening? It is totally cold. It's like minus 30 degrees Celsius out here, so I'm going to make this as quick as possible. But I do have a really cool guest today, so he deserves an introduction. His name is Mike Zaremba, and he is the co-founder of Float House in Vancouver. They've now expanded to different locations in Canada, but him and his brother started the company, and it's basically they have businesses where they rent out sensory deprivation tanks. So what is a sensory deprivation tank? If you haven't heard of it, it's basically, as the name implies, a tank that purposefully tries to eliminate all sensory input to the human body. So how do they do that? Well, you lay in a huge tank full of water, but also full of salt. They put so much salt in the water that it makes you incredibly buoyant, so you can easily float in this tank, and they heat the water to the same temperature as your skin. So after a while, you basically become one with the tank. You no longer feel where your skin ends and the water begins. Very cool idea. They also try to eliminate as much sound and light from the tank as possible as well. So you're in there, all of a sudden your eyes that are constantly viewing the world, your ears that are always listening to what's going on, your sense of touch, all that is eliminated. So your mind has a lot of extra resources to think about other things, to go into other places of consciousness. And it's been something often compared to these psychedelic experiences that I talk about a lot. And so I asked Mike about that. We talk about his own experiences using psychedelic drugs in the tank, and just comparing those experiences outside of the tank, and what the differences are and how they compare. Definitely really interesting. I've never been in a tank still, so I really was excited to ask Mike about these because I have been interested in them for a long time. I've actually been considering building my own tank for years now after hearing people like Joe Rogan sing the praises of these things. But anyway, so we talk about that too, and the idea of building your own tank. And unfortunately, Mike gives me some bad news that there's really not a cheap way to build your own tank. So anyway, we discussed it though. We get into it. Fun conversation, lots of different topics and things we get into. Thanks to Mike. Thanks to you for listening. Check it out. This is me with Mike Zaremba.
I mean, the first few times into a float tank or a sensory deprivation tank is, it's really unique to the individual. That's the first thing I'll always say is that, and there's definitely a learning curve and an accumulation effect with floating. The first float, depending on the person, but it's typically around just getting orientated into this very unique and novel environment that's created by the float tank. So getting one's physical body comfortable in there, their psychological mind comfortable in there, and just getting used to it. And then some people are really easily adaptable to that. They can kind of let themselves relax right into it and let go and have that pretty deep experience right off the bat in terms of relaxation and maybe some introspection. But then, but all other people will have a challenge with it, to be honest with you. That's why we definitely recommend people try it. 3 seems to be the magic number off the bat. Like give it 3 sessions that within a relatively close period, saying within 4 to 6 weeks, try to do 3 floats, and then let that learning curve effect take over, because there's lots of simple things that can happen in there in terms of getting salt in your eyes and bouncing it in there, very simplistic mechanistic things that can take you in and out of the float experience in terms of comfort wise. But then, once you kind of get better, just letting yourself be still in that space, now you can kind of go within and start to do, have that experience. And different people's, we'll start with the mind kind of works in different ways, right? Some people have very active, chatty minds, and it's really uncomfortable. It can be very uncomfortable for some people at first just to be that, intimate with their hyperactive mind. A lot of people use a lot of external distractions, such as, whether they're aware of it or not, such as always having the radio on or a background noise.
I see, yeah.
So it's challenging for some people just to be alone and quiet. So we do actually have the option of having audio played into the tank as
you do that. Okay, I have heard of that.
Yeah, so it's something that we can add to, especially for beginners, to perhaps help them ease into the float experience a bit more. We have these induction tracks, we call them, where it's 30 minutes or so of some sound, ambient sound, very relaxing, not too language based, not too linguistic
Right,
based.
I see.
and then it fades into silence. So it's a little more gentler ease into, say, a full sensory reduced experience.
Right.
But it's super unique, it's super individual, in terms of what someone's going to get out of those first couple floats.
Right.
And so it's just bringing a lot of awareness, to some of those typical meditation techniques of breath awareness and and then just maybe thought observations, trying to be mindful, if you will. So it's a
Right.
great environment to practice those traditional meditation techniques. Absolutely.
Yeah, and then for a lot of people, obviously, like it's such an extreme environment that is just like it's not like really naturally available. Like people don't just like stumble into an environment where they have no sensory input. Like it's a very direct, purposeful kind of experience. So I can imagine for people who grew up, like the way we live today, it is really, we're so stimulated all the time. Like it's really an extreme difference from how we live day to day, with whether it's just being on Snapchat and Instagram and then watching movies and playing video games and having advertising constantly. It's just that totally opposite of like just nothing. And that would be, I think, difficult for someone who doesn't have experience in meditation or things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like how you use the word extreme, because although this is a very gentle, relatively subtle relaxation meditative experience, on some levels it is very extreme. It's very extreme to have maximal sensory reduction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it does take a little bit of orientation, getting used to it. And I think also I'd like to tap into what you said there about what was it you said? I lost my train of thought there.
That's
but
right.
Regardless, being able to just get yourself physically comfortable at first, and which different people have different postural alignments, and then psychologically, mentally comfortable as well.
Right. And then after a bunch of practice, what does someone like you experience in the tank? And how often do you still use the tank? Because obviously it's been years now that you've obviously been practicing and using it. I mean, do you still find it beneficial after this much time?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've been practicing floating for over 5 years now, almost 6 years actually. And I still use it minimum once a week, ideally 2 to 3 times a week.
Wow.
3 times is very luxurious. It's hard for me to squeeze that time in, but if I can, it changes everything in my life when I'm floating 3 times a week, just because you keep resetting your central nervous system and you don't really allow for any accumulation of tension or stress in your body. You keep resetting down to this like baseline level. And so when you're like that, you're much more permeable. Like things don't kind of like ping off you and make a reaction within you. You can kind of just let things, when they come up, you can have a much more balanced, grounded approach with them. And I find my life just easier. There's a better flow to it when I'm floating that regularly.
Really? You find a really direct benefit of regular practice of it?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. I find that, if I haven't floated for a couple weeks, I really start to feel it in my body. I feel the tension start to increase, and I'll just notice it within my psyche, within my moods, and within my cognitive functioning. So that's the tricky thing about floating, is like you really do get a lot more out of it by some sort of regular practice.
Yeah, that's the impression I've gotten as well. And I haven't floated before, but I've heard so much about, like many other people, I've heard Joe Rogan just sing its praises about how much it's benefited his life and whatnot. Right. And it's been very appealing as someone who's interested in some of these other, consciousness altering devices and things. It just has been and I have gotten that impression that it's something that needs practice, and you don't just do it once and you're done kind of thing.
That's right.
For that reason, I've come to the conclusion eventually at some point I'd love to have my own tank at home, because then obviously I can just practice when I'm available and I can make a sort of habit routine out of it. But it's kind of funny for me to say that. Like I'm still kind of wondering if I'm just buying into the hype. I haven't even tried this thing before, yet I'm convinced I should build one in my home, Like I've just heard about it so much.
No, for a lot of people, the thought of it and the way the environment is designed, and it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Like, oh yeah, so what is it like when I take away as much of the external sensory input as possible, and you get to experience what's left. And what's left is you. So it's not necessarily, and this is actually the point I lost on my thread before, was that, it's not that you don't feel anything, you just feel what's left. So instead of being externally orientated with your awareness, which is what we're chronically kind of conditioned to do as North Americans, we don't really have any types of traditions, at least within, the last 200 years, available to, the popular culture, let's say, of inward, introspective awareness driving practices. We just don't have that. And so when you take away as much external sensory input as possible, your awareness doesn't really have any other choice but to go within and to feel what's left. And what's left is you.
Right.
Your thoughts, your emotions, the physical sensations of your body. And you get to be with that in a very different relationship, because it's not like you're seeing your body in a mirror or anything like that. Now you're feeling your body, and you're experiencing your thoughts and what that's like. And so I like to bring as much awareness to the sensations of my body and let those just fill my awareness more and more and more, and they kind of start to push the thoughts to the background more. I can't say like my thoughts stop, I don't get a complete cessation of thinking.
Right.
However, they're not the dominant part of where my awareness is focused. They're kind of just fleeting in the background, and I'm there with the energy of my body. And that's one thing that floating really has helped me identify with, for lack of a better word, is the energy of my body and the energetic sensations that I experience, So just becoming more aware of my energy body, because it feels like it shifts. When I'm in like a crowded place in downtown Vancouver and there's lots of noise, you feel constricted, you feel contracting. Like I look at it like my energy body is coming in. And then when I go for a float or when I go for a hike in nature, you feel much more lighter and expansive. And I believe this is the energy body expanding outwards. Now, this is all like talk and lingo that's pretty esoteric and metaphysical, and it can't really be proven on any level yet.
Right.
But that's what it feels like. And that's what I choose to call it,
Yeah. One of the things that, I think is similar to what you're talking about, and it can maybe be put in more physical terms, and to relate it to the psychedelic experiences. And they're doing studies now. I think there was one just recently, I think it was by David Nutt, who is in the UK, and I think he studied LSD. And they put people in MRIs, I believe, to study the brain under the influence of these things. And one thing that's, I think, really interesting is that, often when people think about taking a drug, like a psychedelic drug, they're thinking about adding something. Like you're putting something in, obviously, and it's just, you're adding hallucinations, you're adding things to your brain. But one thing they found is that it actually decreases activity in a certain part of the brain. I think it's like the frontal cortex. And I'm not like super familiar with the brain functions and things like that. But they found that it decreases activity in this one area and then connects other areas of the brain that don't normally sort of communicate. And that's kind of an interesting thing. Similar, I think, to the isolation tank in that way, where it does decrease certain activity and then maybe stimulates in other areas.
Yeah, I think this is what they're finding in all sorts of these types of flow states and altered states of consciousness of this nature, is that the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, to our higher cognitive functioning elements, does decrease. This default mode network, as it's called, is kind of suppressed a little bit, and it allows for other elements of our brain. You're right, I'm not super familiar with the neurobiology of it all and the neurochemistry, but parts of our brains that usually don't communicate now begin to communicate, and that does absolutely happen with the float tank, and that happens with meditation, and that happens with flow states.
Right.
You start to get these different types of insights or extrapolations. I'm not sure if you use cannabis at all, but cannabis does that as well.
Right.
If you're kind of letting that opportunity happen. A lot of these things, it's not like a guaranteed, like if you go and do it, you're going to have this experience. It's really subjective, very, very intentional based, and set and setting based, obviously, too.
Right. And so maybe like I do imagine we'll get into some psychedelic talk too, and it's something I definitely want to discuss. But maybe before we do, if we can talk maybe just about the actual physical benefits of being in a flotation tank. And like I've heard lots of different things about maybe helping with recovery, for different things, and also even helping people who have like some like disorders like me. And I could really see how maybe someone who has like ADD or something, or some kind of anxiousness type of disorder could be really could be benefited by being in somewhere like the isolation tank.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on this quite a lot the last couple of months, is trying to bring out the most contemporary research, like primary published research available on flotation rest, which is called flotation rest. The acronym REST stands for Restricted Environmental Stimulus Therapy, and that's what all the kind of scholarly documents are calling it, and that's what it was labeled back in the day. So REST, and I kind of divided into flotation rest or flotation therapy for mental health, and then flotation therapy for chronic pain. So in terms of pain management, first, physically being supported by a solution. So we put 900 pounds of Epsom salts into this water. It's about 10 inches deep. And so you're physically supported every square millimeter of the surface area of your body by the solution to the exact, to a very specific density. And just that alone, just the sensation of floating alone is very relieving to the joints and to the muscles and connective tissues of our body. And obviously you're floating in 900 pounds of Epsom salts, which is magnesium sulfate. So we've all heard about Epsom salt baths and how magnesium can be absorbed through the skin and actually can promote further muscle tension release. And so that's part of it as well. And then when you get into the sensory reduction part of the environment, where there's no light, no sound, no tactile sensations, no temperature variations, your central nervous system starts to really relax. Like, it's called the relaxation response for a reason. It's literally the opposite of fight or flight, which is actually what a lot of people are chronically kind of stuck in. And we're normalized in fight or flight. Like, we are chronically and typically in a stressful state. We are a culture that is addicted to coffee. Coffee is caffeine, directly impacts your adrenal glands, and you secrete adrenaline.
Right. Yeah.
And that's our normal state. We don't feel normal until we have our morning coffee typically.
Yeah, right.
And that for me this is a little side tangent. That was a red flag for me. When I realized I didn't feel normal until I had my coffee, I'm like, okay, I don't know if that's a good thing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
To feel normal until I'm stimulated. So that's why I quit coffee. And so when we get this mega suppression of our central nervous system, this calming effect, we start to suppress those stress hormones such as epinephrine and cortisol, and we secrete different things like dopamine and endorphins in our body, those feel good hormones. And so when that also helps with pain relief as well. When we have stress hormones circulating in our bodies, we're going to have a higher perception of pain. When we have greater muscle tension in our body, we're going to have a higher perception of pain.
Right.
So part of it is not just the physical relaxation, but also the biochemical relaxation and change in our system that decreases this perception of pain. And so it's great for chronic pain issues such as fibromyalgia.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's some loose publications on rheumatoid arthritis as well, whiplash, post-concussion treatment as well, because concussion protocol, the brain is damaged, and like they say,
they say avoid any, like, don't read anything, don't see any screens. Yeah, I've heard that a lot about concussion.
Totally. So that there's no research on that yet with float tanks, but I definitely could see that.
It makes total sense. Yeah.
Right. That natural pairing is definitely an immediate post-concussion protocol to help to just relax and maybe accelerate healing. We don't know yet, but I could totally see that as a legit hypothesis.
Yeah. Even what you said there, just about the fact that, like, I hadn't really totally thought about that. That of course you're just floating, because normally at least one area of your body is flexed. Like, if I'm sitting, my abs are still flexed, my lower back is still supporting me. If I'm walking, my legs are flexing and supporting me. When you're floating, all of your muscles can actually relax, and that's a pretty rare thing to have as well.
Yeah, even compared to lying down or in a zero gravity chair. In fact, The research that's really coming out right now for floating, there's a whole new flotation lab out at Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's associated with the Laureate Brain Research Institute,
Mm.
and they're doing research there where they'll have their one group of subjects floating in a float tank, and then the control group is actually deep relaxing in a zero gravity chair. So like extreme relaxation, and they're still finding significant difference between the floating group and the non-floating group. So
Wow.
floating in a float tank is different than just relaxing in a dark room
Right.
on the bed. There's a distinct difference that's happening. And
Or
now
just being in a hot tub or something. Like it's
totally,
yeah.
or we've gotten people on our Facebook page or emails, or mostly on Facebook, saying like, I'll just do one in my bathtub.
Yeah, right.
All right, go for it. How comfortable is that? You're not going to get nearly as precise. Like, we get our environments very dialed in. They're very precise, and they're very spacious.
Right.
Yeah. But actually, that's something that I'll tap into typically if people aren't familiar with floating. Is we often get the comment about, what if I'm claustrophobic?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And that's a natural apprehension for sure. But really, the experience is no different than closing your eyes at night when you're falling asleep. It gets dark, you close your eyes, and with floating, it's important to remember that you're always in control. You can get out whenever you want.
You're not locked in there or anything.
You're not locked in, and they're quite spacious physically. And there's different designs. There's like the tanks is what we carry. There's also pods. There's cabins which have even more volume. But ultimately, the experience is the same. It's dark, it's quiet, and you're floating. But once you kind of get in there, and once you get over that little mental apprehension, that hurdle of being enclosed, but yet knowing you can get out whenever you want, once you kind of settle in and realize I'm safe and I can trust this space, it actually starts to feel much more expansive, because you have no perceptions of boundaries.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah. People talk about just the experience of kind of starting to have the impression that they're like floating in space, that they're like they're out there, and the sort of limitations fade away of the normal. Yeah.
And it's actually not uncommon for the first couple floats, and it usually does go away after this, is to actually feel like you're floating instead of in a horizontal position, to be floating vertically, or to have this like tilting sensation, or these spinning sensations. And I just attribute that is to our inner ears and our equilibrium there. Not being able to get any type of orientation because the effects of gravity are minimized. So it's really unique sometimes that you feel like you're spinning or tilting and like you are in outer space, but those sensations typically do go away after a couple floats. And for some people, it's not even uncommon that type of sensation can actually cause nauseousness, like motion.
Yeah, I could see that for certain people, yeah.
Some people do get sensitive, but if they can kind of just, work with that, maybe pause from time to time, opening the door and getting out if they do feel nauseous, that will go away. It's just the inner ears trying to get some sort of establishment in there.
Right.
So anyway, that's a whole side tangent, but
yeah. No, I mean, for me, I know that I don't really get claustrophobic. I think I kind of like being in smaller spaces, or, I like being in a room with the door shut. I don't like having it open. I kind of like that. And I feel like I definitely at some point got to try the tank. I know that I would get a lot out of it, but I do know, like, I was talking about it with someone just the other day, and they kind of like made it sound like a coffin. They were like talking about how, oh my God, I'm not going to lock myself in a little box, and and they had the more claustrophobic kind of feeling toward it, which is, you can understand that.
But it's cool to me. Like, we'll get that, people will have that kind of initial knee-jerk reaction before we even get to really explain. Let's talk about this environment. They'll have that reaction, but yet they still want to come in and try it. There's something about it that is super intriguing. It's like, I wonder what that would be like.
Yeah, right.
And what that experience is like. And so for me, that always is it's a funny thing to kind of observe within the business. Is we have these people super apprehensive, making up a lot of huff and a puff about this claustrophobic thing, even though they are safe and they're in control. It's literally just a giant bathtub. but yet they still want to do it. And that's really cool. It shows me that there's something deeper on this curiosity level that can draw even the most nervous people to do it. They want to see what it's like.
Right. Well, I've heard other people describe it not like a coffin, but like a womb, like being back in the womb, like
Absolutely.
because it's warm, like the water is heated to the temperature of your skin, kind of thing. So, and yeah, just being, I don't know. I've even heard it described like people experience like this idea of being held or being comforted in some way or something like that.
Absolutely. And again, that like you can release every portion of your body. So it feels like you're perfectly held in that solution. And it's an amazing environment for like, regressionary memories and regressionary therapy. Like I had a cool float the other day where I decided to just kind of go into a part of my adolescence when I was like 13 and kind of relive a memory there. And I kind of just started with the basic memories that I could have now. But when I was in that deeper float state, the details and like I was able to remember a lot more once I got in there. So I think there's something with the brainwave activity that helps induce a lot of memory recall, and yeah, and it truly is like a womb-like experience. It's like warm ambient fluid. You hear your breath, your heartbeat.
Right. Yeah.
And it's really cool, man.
Yeah.
It's really
Something you said when you were talking about the nervous system before, and recently I interviewed someone on this podcast who is a trauma therapist, and they worked very physically with people and talked a lot about the nervous system and how our nervous system really learns patterns. And for a lot of people, if they have post-traumatic stress disorder, they've had traumatic events in their life, they are, like you said earlier, stuck in that fight or flight, or they're stuck with this nervous system physical response to certain stimuli or certain environments. And it does sound like the tank being able to release a lot of things and just relax in such a deep way that for that kind of thing, it does seem like it would be very useful for people to, in some way, sort of relax that nervous system and at least let it rest for a while. Because it seems like some people do have that hyperactive kind of tension going on.
Yeah, there's some really cool research that is happening out of that Laureate Brain Research Institute with the float tanks. And they're starting to actually really understand this portion of the brain that is hyperactive in people with PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And it's called the salience network, spelled SALIANCE, salience. And this is showing to be hyperactive in people with PTSD or anxious people or people with depression, I believe, as well. And floating seems to be directly modulating that aspect of our brain. And there's a really cool YouTube, it's a news story on YouTube. If you just search PTSD float tank of these veterans down in Austin, Texas, who got into floating, and they were able to get off every single one of their anti-anxiety meds and their treatment medications.
Wow, that's pretty crazy.
Alone. So PTSD, anxiety is actually probably where floating has the most impact. Like pain management is definitely a part of it, but the mental health aspects of anxiety, PTSD, insomnia issues, burnout syndrome, those type of things, that's where floating will, I think, really become a force within the mental health community because of its really potent effects on it and completely natural.
Yeah. That's the cool thing about it. I mean, it definitely, a lot of the research on these psychedelics shows similar things, but what's so cool about floating is that there's no drug involved, and so it's very open for people to try without having to battle through weird stigma and whatnot.
And it's a great place to start even before those types of treatments, and like, you'd have to do probably, depending on the ailment in the individual, but, a lot of the research is showing doing multiple floats, 1 or 2 per week for an extended period of, like, say 6, 8, 12 weeks. But that's where they're getting the most significant amount of results,
Right.
Whereas you might do like MDMA assisted psychotherapy for treatment resistant PTSD, and, they're doing like 3 treatments. So they're just different levels of intensity, but ultimately I think can get to very similar results. And this is all still yet to be fully proven, but it's shown similar.
Right. And so one of the other things that I wanted to compare to, because for me, I've never been in a tank, so I can only compare different experiences to this. And one that I have experienced this year, I've been lucky enough to be part of 2 sweat lodge ceremonies with First Nations here in the Yukon. And I definitely felt like, in at least some ways, it could be compared to this isolation tank. Mainly the one being that in a sweat lodge, it's also completely dark. There's no light, so they remove that sensory input, and and also it's very sound dampening. But obviously, the differences being, you are in a group setting, you're with a bunch of other people, and there's often like singing, active praying going on, and obviously extreme heat as well. So it is different, but it seems like it could induce a similar type of mindset.
Yeah, a lot of these there's a lot of indigenous practices or Eastern practices that do incorporate elements of sensory reduction, and light being one of those big ones, and also sound deadened at times as well, like different pyramids and temples.
Yeah, I've heard of that too.
Retreating into caves, you know what I mean, for meditative purposes. So going into the sweat lodge, you're right. I've done a couple as well, and I'd like to do more. And I was impressed, actually, as a connoisseur of darkness. Impressed by their ability to get those things very light proof.
Yeah.
Right. And so that can be very very similar between the float tank. It's like having that level of darkness where you open and close your eyes and there's no difference.
Yeah, right.
And that's a really cool part of it, because there's something that happens when we start to take away different elements of sensory input. It seems to have an impact on our nervous system, on our brains, and opens us up for a different experience.
And do you think there's any room, like when you look at maybe the future of isolation tanks? Like I have heard of people, like you mentioned earlier, like adding audio. Like I think it was the guy in California who's big into the float tank world, where he's looking at adding like some sort of like learning, like adding some kind of, not documentary, but like you can start learning a language in the tank or something. And my question is like, what do you see a lot of room for growth in as far as isolation tanks go? Do you think it would benefit to have, could multiple people float at the same time? Would that be any kind of benefit? Or
yeah, well, we'll touch on that one first. There are double tanks that exist.
Okay.
So I've never tried one, but they are out there. I think that would be a very cool experience for, I say, a couple who are both experienced floaters, because you want to go with someone that's not going to be splashing around or
right.
or whatever. So once you're both pretty established in a float practice, I think that would be a phenomenal practice to do as a partnership, just as a very intimate space to share energetically. In terms of technologies, I think the gentleman Crash down in California, they're talking about, he was trying to design different monitors to go inside the float tank with really low light emission. I don't think he's really into that so much anymore. However, there are people starting to experiment with virtual reality in a float tank. So I could definitely see expanding more as people, because you are in this very floating like environment, and then you can throw on maybe a water VR.
I hadn't thought of that. That's a cool idea.
Yeah, so that's starting to go down as well. Other technologies with the float tank I could see becoming much more useful is like different hypnotherapy and like affirmation programming, audio audio programs. So whether it's like like different forms of affirmations or hypnotherapy.
Oh yeah, I see. Right.
I can see that happening. Guided journeys, going on guided meditation, guided journeys, shamanic journeys. And then also they're starting to create these waterproof EEGs. So just measuring devices. So you're able to put on this one node EEG on your forehead and measure your brain waves and record that via an app in your phone throughout the float. So these are things coming down probably in the next 2 to 5 years, I would imagine. So people can like start to measure different elements of the experience.
Right.
And that one the EEG thing is really cool because the gentleman that's behind the business of that, he was explaining at the float conference this past year in Portland, Oregon, that you'll be able to like actually signature mark different elements of your float experience. So let's say you're in the tank and you kind of go deep into your meditation and you're there, then something happens and you want to track that. If you blink a couple times, it'll actually like mark that part. So you can
crazy.
See what was going on in your brain activity at that distinct part.
Wow.
Really cool shit coming down the pipe.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the obvious next question is like, have you experimented? Because obviously you've spoken publicly about your use of different psychedelics. I know you've talked about ayahuasca. You mentioned cannabis. I don't know what else you have experience with, but have you experimented with being in the tank under influence of these things?
I have, in terms of cannabis, psilocybin, and kratom and kava kava. So let's start with cannabis because it's probably going to be the most common one.
Right.
People, it's very common. Obviously, Joe Rogan very much popularized that as well as combining cannabis with the float tank. And I'd say for anyone who's interested in that, first just go experience floating on its own.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the stress is like at least try it sober, like get good at it, get comfortable with it first, right?
Agreed. Yeah, exactly. That way you can kind of see what that experience is like with just your energy.
Yeah.
And then when you start to add, a spirit plant medicine, something like cannabis, something that has its own energetic properties, and you take that into your body and experience that energy, then you can see what that experience is like, and it's and obviously smoking is going to be different than eating it as well.
Mm-hmm.
The edible in a float tank can be extremely psychedelic, for sure. So I definitely would say start with just a decent amount, and also if you are going to do that, might want to book a double float, have two the back, because the first, if you just do a 60 or 90-minute float when you're doing a cannabis float, it just seems to go by like that. Like you can just keep going. It seems like you're just in this really deep state. And then in terms of psilocybin, definitely, make sure you're experienced with psilocybin, make sure you're experienced with the float tank, and make sure, you sell yourself up for, a potential, like a good scenario. Like if you're in a limited time and you're only doing a 60-minute float or a 90-minute float and you're doing psilocybin, like that's not really enough time.
Yeah, you got to take into consideration psilocybin is going to last a few hours by itself. So
totally. So I would definitely reserve that for the right scenario in terms of like if you know somebody with a private tank, or the owner of the float center and they kind of know what's going on, and it's okay, it is safe, but any of these sorts of things, they're very intense experiences, and they're not to be just, I think the more reverence and respect you can bring to those, the better,
Right. So you want to make sure to put up disclaimers on this stuff. Like you've tried it, but you're also super experienced with the tank and you've already experienced these things separately.
Totally.
So what has your experience been with combining them just personally?
Oh man, amazing. Like sometimes very challenging for sure. Sometimes very challenging, very intense, but other times just extremely beautiful. And, like any psychedelic experience, it definitely can reveal a lot to you about yourself, about the nature of reality, your existential part in this whole, of this whole experience. So, for me, it's been, really, really powerful. I don't do that too regularly though. I typically stick, like I've dabbled in it all, but I typically will just do floating now. I don't use cannabis too much anymore. My ayahuasca use has kind of just shifted my relationship with it quite a bit. And so I find I like to experience them more separately now. So if I'm going to do a psilocybin ceremony, go and do that and just work with that. Cannabis likewise, and then floating and ayahuasca. I don't start to combine them too much anymore. I want to kind of work with them in their own each thing, and that way I'm just kind of trying to tap into the essence of whatever that experience could be. But that's just me personally, what I've gotten into. So it doesn't, whatever people want to try is obviously, freedom with their own consciousness, sovereignty over their own consciousness, right? So, but Yeah, and then I mentioned a couple other ones, kratom and kava kava. So kratom is a psychoactive plant out of Thailand,
Yeah, that's
and
the one that recently was in the news because it was it was going to be made illegal, but then they took that back.
yeah, which was really unprecedented. Actually,
Yeah,
they did a very rush job to get it on a Schedule 1, which
right,
is fucking crazy.
right.
You know?
Yeah, I don't have any experience with kratom. So what kind of effects does that produce?
Well, it's very calming. It's very relaxing. It's
Mm.
kind of it is like it feels like an opiate. It feels like
Okay.
have you ever had morphine before?
Yeah, I have in the hospital.
Yeah, me too. And it feels like that.
Hmm.
Yeah, it feels like
Okay.
morphine, and it's actually being used to help people get off opiate addictions. You
Wow.
know, and it's a natural thing. Like,
So it's kind of like pain relief and relaxation type of.
totally, and it's very complementary with the float tank. Like
Hmm. Oh yeah, I could see that.
one of the best combos with the float tank, in my opinion.
And does it
Uh,
have much like what are the sort of negative effects of something like that?
to be honest, I don't know. I'm not too familiar with it. I know all I really know of it is that in lower doses it's more stimulating, and that higher doses it's more sedating.
Okay.
And typically people go for the higher doses,
Right.
just being like a stimulating thing. So I don't know too much about it. And like any of these things, like, do your homework.
Yeah,
Be
yeah.
for your own health and safety and wellness.
Hmm.
And that's what we need to empower. I think as a greater topic of conversation is self-empowerment of all these things so that we can have freedom. So we're not living in this infantilized society where daddy and mommy take care of us. We need to take care of ourselves and take care of each other.
Yeah.
But that requires responsibility.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so it, what was the other one? You kratom and
Oh, kava kava.
kava kava. What is that?
So kava kava is a Polynesian herbal root. Actually, it's related to the pepper plant, and it's used. It's been used in the Fijian Islands, Cook Islands, Micronesia, and those areas. And it's actually like they use it for ceremony. They use it for social purposes as well, cultural, like gatherings and dancing and stuff like that. And it's kind of like the fact of having a glass of wine in terms of just takes that edge off, but you're not intoxicated with alcohol, So it kind of just it's a natural anti-anxiolytic, so it's calming, and and we actually
Right.
sell that at a float house. Is we can do 2-ounce shots of that before
Oh,
you go.
and that's totally legal.
I think it's a gray zone.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's a gray
One of
zone.
those, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think it's totally approved by like Health Canada and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we advise people to take their own caution, but it is there available. So it's one of those things like I don't know, yeah, we take a chance with that for sure, in our business to have that available. And
But it sounds like what you're saying with a lot of these is the ones that go together most with floating are things that help you relax the most. Like it's about
totally.
relaxing, and that's something. There was a little like a 5-minute clip of Joe Rogan on YouTube talking about how he approaches flotation and how he gets the most out of it. And it was something that actually, after I listened to it, it actually helped me fall asleep. Some of his practices that he used in the tank, and he was talking about basically the idea of letting go, and that he would just constantly work on just letting go constantly. So, and then he would say like as soon as he would think about letting go, he'd already messed up and he had to just start all over again and just really let go of everything that came in. And that's something that I've tried while trying to fall asleep, and it really did help for a while, just that idea. And it seems like that's what a lot of the tank experience is about, is just completely relaxing as much as you can, your mind, your body, and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. We call it's the art of letting go. And that's something that is like a fundamental teaching of like Buddhism and things like that. It's like recognizing the ever changing nature of reality, the fact that everything is always in nothing is static, everything is moving. Even the most solid things are
Right,
not just solid, and so the transient nature of the universe is a constant. And we can, like, even if we wanted to, I think Alan Watts has some really inspirational kind of lectures on this stuff about how, like, even if we wanted to hang on to something, you can't. You literally can't. On a metaphysical level, on a quantum physics level, you can't hold on to anything. We live in a flow.
Mm.
And so the art of letting go is kind of tapping into that natural flow of the universe and letting yourself go with it. And
Mm.
this is something that we definitely struggle with in North America, I believe. I think
Yeah.
that we it's hard for us to let go. We don't want to let go, and our ego wants to hold on.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this in a lot of different areas across politics, across different types of cultural norms, or whatever. And it really does help you. The tank can teach you that if you let it, for
Mm.
sure. And those are the people that float consistently seem to learn that lesson and practice it. And the ones that try it and get out and say it's not for me, it's probably why they
Mm.
probably can't let go, and it's really hard, and that's okay. But it can be addressed, it can be practiced, and you can do it.
Right. Yeah, so one thing I was going to ask you about is how a practice of floating, how floating for you has helped you sort of day to day. And it seems like maybe that's one of the main ways is by embracing that kind of mindset. But I will ask just, how do you find just day to day, everyday life changing by using the tank?
Yeah, I mean, in lots of different ways. I definitely get, I practice yoga regularly, I exercise regularly, and my body, and I've been a long time athlete. I played university football, and so I
Mm.
put a lot of miles in my body, and it doesn't recover as quickly as it used to. So I find it definitely helps me with physical recovery.
Mm.
It helps take away a lot of aches and pains if I'm kind of sore. Like I was helping my buddy move the other day, and we're lifting these gigantic tables, really awkward, super sore. I went for a float the next day, and the reduction of my soreness dramatically,
Wow.
anecdotally shifted after that one float, because things relax, things settle down.
That is one of the things that is most appealing to me about it, is that physical recovery. Like, I dabble in weightlifting and whatnot, and I also kind of sidetrack, but I play soccer regularly. So I'm always
Sure.
trying to like recover between, like, if I'm doing like deadlifting and then I have to play soccer, I have to let my legs recover, and to have something to speed up that recovery process would be just so useful.
Yeah, and it does it really well, and partially because of that super relaxation response, that suppression of the stress hormones. When you have stress hormones circulating in your body, stress hormones are catabolic, meaning they break you
Mm.
down. That's what they're
Right.
designed to do. They're designed for mobilization, so you can
Mm.
fight or flight. But they're not supposed to be chronically available in our system. So when you get rid of those things that break us down, and then we start letting our body actually heal and recover, because we're not in this stressful, stimulated state, we get an accelerated recovery. It's
Mm.
pretty straightforward, which is, why more athletes are getting involved with floating. Different football players, basketball players. I think Stephen Curry is probably the
Mm.
poster boy right now of floaters,
Oh,
of
cool.
athlete floaters. He's the two-time NBA All-Star these
Yeah.
last 2 years. He floats, I think, every week.
Wow.
You
No
know,
way. That's really cool.
yeah, he's been huge for the industry to get more athletic notoriety.
Mm.
Um, but even still, I think there's still a huge wave of that as well, for floating for performance.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
that's a whole other element. But I find it helps me just with sleep, jet lag,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
and then just being calm, just being calmer
Right.
all the time. It just makes a huge difference, and that has a huge effect on your psyche, your mood, your creativity, your critical thinking, all these types of things. It makes me more sensitive. It makes me
Mm.
more like open and receptive to love, to being able to give love and receive love, and be more intimate, and just be more present with my partners, with my relationships.
Right.
Partner, I should say partner, uh, and my relationships. So it's those are the way it kind of impacts my life the most. And then I do enjoy the self exploration, the exploration of the universe. I
Right.
don't
Yeah.
I don't know what consciousness is, and nobody knows what consciousness is.
Yeah, right. That's an important thing to bring up too. Is, yeah, it's just like it sounds like a fun experience. When you get good at it and you can actually relax. It sounds like it's just interesting. Like a lot of these psychedelics, like they've been talked up so much about all the potential healing and benefits and medicinal properties, but it's also like just an interesting, really fun, curious experience to have, is like to use psilocybin mushrooms or something, and that's a big part of it too.
Yeah, just to experience your human consciousness, just to experience your human form without, like, elements of the ego kind of there, and just experiencing it for literally just what it is. These things just kind of seem to amplify what happens all the time,
Right.
whether it's floating, meditation, or an entheogenic experience, it kind of just amplifies what we always feel, but we just feel it more. And then
Yeah,
you're like,
yeah,
whoa, it feels fucking awesome to be
yeah,
alive. Like, what a unique experience, you
yeah.
know? Like that guy, Gary Vanderchuk. Have you seen him on social media?
No.
He's like a social media kind of guru guy, marketing guru guy, but,
Okay, yeah,
and I don't really resonate too much with what he says. He's very go, go, go.
right.
Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I try to have a little bit more balance, I feel. But he says something really cool that I do appreciate, and that is, we already won the lottery. You are a human being,
Mm,
like you are a human being, and you won the lottery by being a human being and having this human existence and this human experience. And so these things kind of let us get in touch with
hmm,
that primal intimacy of being a human being.
right. Some of that
And that's
appreciation.
totally just appreciate the fact that you can walk and eat and breathe.
Yeah, right. It's that just perspective change. You know, it's funny. Like, this is random too, probably. But last night I went to a play, and it was of the "It's a Wonderful Life." Do you know? It was a movie. It's like a Christmas kind of movie, I think.
Yes, right. Yeah.
But anyway, it's like this guy who he ends up just getting miserable because, his kids are annoying and he's broke and whatever. And there's all these things that he's just focused on, and he's just, and he gets to the point where he thinks he should just kill himself because it'd be better if he was dead. And then so like an angel comes down and he's like, you know what? It would be better if I just was never born. And then the angel shows the guy like, if this is what life would be like if you weren't here. And he just shows how everyone is a little more miserable without him being around and whatnot. It was just that perspective change, though, that, we can have appreciation for our life. And sometimes we do get too caught up in the little stuff that makes us anxious and pissed off or nervous. And we focus on that when really there's so much more that we can focus on. And to have that, just that time to reflect sometimes allows us to really appreciate those kind of things.
Yeah, I agree completely, and that's why like I do all these things on some level because of that, doing a regular yoga practice, meditation practice, floating practice.
Right.
And then even more spaced out from that is like, the entheogen ceremony elements. I'm actually just in the middle of a dieta to go back to Peru and do another retreat there with ayahuasca. And
Wow.
I'll do these, on different frequencies, So I find a seated meditation practice almost daily to be awesome for some things. Floating practice once or twice a week, yoga practice once or twice a week, 3 times a week, hiking in nature, any of these things, like they just shift me into a different state where I can just appreciate the now. I can appreciate myself and the beingness and the people and the things that I do have. And I just going into that real prayer of gratitude and
Right.
really feeling that, not just mentally projecting it, like really feeling fucking grateful for all the things that I have in my life and just for this life experience in general, and that's a constant practice for me. And it, it's something that I've been developing and just kind of really getting into a lot the last year and a half, just, and it just keeps to grow. Like, it's interesting to see. I'm sure you can go in hindsight, look back on anyone's journey, including yourself, and just look at, the way you've grown and the way you've, you look at things in the world and how I don't know, it's special, man. And I don't really understand it or describe it, but I'm just so grateful for the whole thing. And I try to bring that with these practices to the forefront all the time.
Right. Yeah. That seems to be like where a lot of this is how I feel about a lot of the stuff, whether like some of these psychedelic things, is that the healing that they have comes from first changing this perspective, this mindset, changing your perspective on the life that you live. And that seems like that itself reduces anxiety. Like that reduces depression by just having a shift of perspective and see priorities change and go, oh man, I should just be grateful. This is amazing that I'm here. It's awesome. And that reduces stress. Like it's not just that some physical characteristic that psilocybin goes in and like reduces stress. It's that it creates this process of thinking about things differently that leads to these other things.
Yeah. And I also find like on those amazing occasions when it does happen is being able to just get this really deep understanding that everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Everything's going to be okay. Like when I die, it's okay.
Yeah.
and it's all okay. And like when I have that experience, and I tap into that, and that just seems to be a grace experience of how that comes about. But man, there's something about that is incredibly healing, I believe, and just taking away all those existential anxieties. Like when you have that full release, you're just like, oh, I feel it. I feel it a lot in my stomach, and just when I have that release, the tension there is gone, and I'm just like, wow, everything's cool, everything's okay,
Right.
and it's always going to be okay, no matter what Trump gets elected or
yeah.
state of the environment is. I mean, these are important issues. However, eventually our sun will burn out. Eventually, this earth will not be here, but it's all okay, and that's the beauty of it, is that we get to have this experience for whatever reason. We were born at this day and age, in this time, to be in a human form, in this state of the civilization, and this is what we get to experience. And whatever happens after that is going to happen. And so it really is all okay, and it's really awesome for me when I can really get myself feeling that experience.
Yeah, and it seems to be like with all these practices we talk about, like the tank, it's what's hard is to hold on to these experiences, right? Like it's easy to have these things and then to drift back into the chaos of the world. So it seems very useful, like you're doing, is to just implement a bunch of practices that all sort of intertwine and help you connect to that feeling and that graciousness and all that. So on that note, because I do want to get into this before we wrap up, is
Sure.
that, I would love to implement the practice of an isolation tank into my life. And, there, where I live in the Whitehorse in the Yukon, there isn't any tank rental or place I can go. So I was hoping to talk about sort of the nuts and bolts of actually, like, if I was going to build my own tank, like, what are the sort of costs associated? What are the things I could build myself, and what would I have to sort of order out? And maybe we can get into a bit of the nuts and bolts of making a tank.
Yeah, I mean, I've never made a tank, and the people that I do know who've got involved in the manufacturing business, which is a growing part of the industry as well, as all these new manufacturers coming on board, it is really tough.
That's what I have got to understand. It's not a simple process.
It's not. It sounds simple. It sounds really simple, but once you start like really digging into it, and you want to make something that lasts, it's not. Now, there's a gentleman named Shane Scott. Sorry, Shane, if I butchered your last name there. He at least used to have a little thing you could purchase online called isolationtankplans.com, and you can buy isolation.
I might have seen that. I think I've come across that in my research.
So he built something, and he breaks it down on how to build it. So that's one resource. To be honest, I mean, and then he ended up inventing the Zen float tent.
Okay,
so
I have seen that as well. Yeah, it's like an alternative, and it's cheaper.
Exactly. For bang for your buck, if you're going to build your own tank, I would say order the Zen float tent.
Yeah.
That would be my advice. I've never floated one though, so I mean, it's you'd want to at least speak with somebody who's not the manufacturer, who has experience with that, who can tell you the pros and cons of it. And if you think it's all pros, then
I've looked into it a little bit. It sounds like those tents won't be as soundproof. Like you need to wear earplugs probably. And I think, I mean, in general, in my mind, having more of a tank setup is more appealing, I think. I have a garage where I have a nice corner where a tank would fit great. So I'm kind of steering toward one day doing that. But the complication of it is obviously like the filtration system and the water pump part is like probably quite expensive and not something it's easy to just come up with on your own. Like you probably need to order that at least.
I mean, basically, a half horsepower water, like pool spa pump would work. The one that we use is called a Whisper Flow, and a half horsepower, probably even a quarter horsepower would be more than enough. And then you need ideally like a UV light filter. So Delta UV is one manufacturer, Delta UV light. will work really well. And then you need like a filter, like a cartridge filter, so like an accordion style cartridge filter.
Right. Yeah.
And so those are the three general components that you basically need: is a UV light filter, which is just a UV light chamber, and then the accordion filter, and then the pump. And then you also need to obviously have salt, Epsom salts. You need about
You need
800.
a lot of that, so that becomes a little
Yeah.
expensive as well.
It is expensive. It's for a public purchase, it's looking about $600 for a full tank fill. And then as long as you keep your water clean, you'll only add a little bit of salt and water as time goes on.
Right.
And probably never have to do a full dump unless you have like a complete severe contamination. You can kind of keep that water going.
Right.
Every time you come out of the tank, you'll have a little bit of water on you, salt on you. So every weeks, depending on the usage, every 1 month or so, you might have to add some salt and some water.
Right.
So there's ongoing cost for the salt there.
It is a little different if obviously, like if I'm just using the tank myself, in comparison to like renting out tanks, it's another sort of standard of cleanliness and things that you have to incorporate. It becomes a little more.
Yeah, but then all you need in terms of a disinfectant, especially if you're just doing a home practice, is you can order somewhere, hopefully somehow, is 35% food grade hydrogen peroxide. So hydrogen peroxide, it'll be your oxidizing agent. Your UV light will be your disinfecting agent, and then the salt itself. So between those three things, the salt, the filter, UV light, and the hydrogen peroxide, keeping your peroxide at about 100 parts per million, you will keep that water nice and clean. And then you can add little things like spa enzyme, things that eat any type of oily film.
Yeah, I see. Right.
So a lot of pool maintenance practices fall in alignment with it. The unique thing, obviously, is the Epsom salts. So that does have a little bit more damaging effects to the pump, and it seems to break it down more. The seals kind of go on the pumps, and then it just starts to, salt kind of gets everywhere. Salt, like, it's very hard. And so putting in something like an unfinished basement or garage is not a bad idea, just because I actually, when I started, I had it in my condo here, actually literally right where I'm sitting. I used to have the tank. And it definitely damaged my laminate floor.
Right. Yeah. Salt. Yeah, can do that for sure.
Yeah. So it's very corrosive stuff. But
do you mind sharing the tanks that you have, like the cost of them, because you're not making them, you're buying them, that you use in your float? Was it the float house? Yeah,
Float House is our business, and we have the Oasis relaxation system. This Oasis float tank. It's definitely that traditional tank style, so the coffin style, but they're very spacious. That's kind of what the traditional tanks look like. They'll run about $12,000 US per tank.
Wow. Yeah.
The Samadhi tank was actually the original float tank. Samadhi Tank Co. is another company. They also make a traditional tank style, and they're about $10,000. There's another,
not cheap to buy them. It's crazy.
No, there's another one, the Escape Pod. He's probably got some good tanks that are reasonable. You can probably get one for $5,000-6,000. His baseline one. Very solid tanks, very durable. And here's the thing too. I'm not sure this is what we did. This is how my brother and I got started. Is we bought a tank. We bought a Samadhi float tank for $10,000, and then just started hosting people to use it. And we got that tank paid for within about a year.
Oh yeah. Right.
So, just charging $40 an hour or whatever, or $40 a use, whatever. Keep it casual, keep it whatever you want, and it pay for itself eventually,
Right. There is a demand for it for sure these days. Like, it's not that common to find tanks. Yeah.
I mean, if you're, on your own within your communities, you can find probably 20 to 30, 50 people maybe that want to use that thing, and they'll help you. They'll contribute to it. You know what I mean? And over time, or you do a little GoFundMe page or something like that, and to see, even if you get half of it covered, and then you start charging for time in there and sharing it with the people, because that's what it's all about. You want to get it exposed to as many people as possible that could benefit from it.
You want to spread it. Yeah, for sure. And so having used tanks for a long time, say I was going to make my own, what are some things that maybe you've seen or heard that like some designs that could be like sort of flaws in like I've heard that in some designs they have unfortunate like sort of ceiling structure where like you'll get drips dripping on you while you're in the tank, which is distracting, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. So trying to figure out those types of like slanted ceilings or curved ceilings so that the water ideally drips down the side, but even that's not foolproof. Like that's why these, like, the end design of these things is really challenging. So
Mm.
I think Shane, the guy that was selling the build your own isolation tanks, he was using, oh man, I don't know what it was, some sort of like large plastic, maybe like a water container or something like that, like something you would have outdoors,
Okay.
like a big water like reservoir type thing, and he cut it in half,
Hmm.
and then created a hinging mechanism on that. But
Wow. Yeah, it does get like it sounds simple in theory, but in practicality, it's like it's quite the design process, I think.
totally, unless like you have a legit engineering background or
Yeah, yeah.
tracking construction background, it is going to be really challenging to build your own tank and build a good one. That's why, but and costly too, to a degree, like probably at least $2, $3, $4, $5,000, I bet. Like if you're trying to just figure it out on your own by the
Yeah.
time different mistakes and stuff like that. That's why like something like the Zen float tank. And here's the thing I wanted to touch on before is that you said, the tent, it's the Zen float tent wasn't super soundproof, but no tank is fully soundproof.
Mm.
None of them. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So we actually have to construct our rooms at Float House to be very sound deadened. We put the tanks on top of isolation pads that we buy. So no one's created the perfect tank yet. No one's created the perfect thing. We're getting newer designs all the time, but getting something like a Zen float tent and then putting it in as quiet a spot possible, it's going to be pretty solid. And then floating at different times when it's not busy, like Sunday mornings is a quieter time, and you're going to have a quieter float. In the evenings, it's going to be quieter, But if you're floating and it's like rush hour traffic or something, then yeah, you're going to hear more.
Right. So that's an interesting point. So it's not reasonable to expect the tank to be fully 100% soundproof.
No, nor even light proof. A lot of the pods aren't even light proof.
Really?
So a lot of companies have to put light motion sensors on in their rooms so that when the people actually go inside the pod, close the door, and there's no more movement in the room, then the lights go off when there's no more motion detected.
Okay.
So, I mean, just because you can buy a more expensive one and put it in doesn't mean you're going to have the perfect float guaranteed. Far, far from it, actually. This is a very early infantile industry still, and there's lots of development still to happen and lots of things to learn. And that's, we've been in it from really early on relatively, and have learned a ton and done a lot of unique modifications to our tanks just to get them into a better float experience. Right.
Yeah. You do kind of make it seem like that tent is a pretty good alternative, because it is. I mean, I forget the exact price, but it was under $2,000, I believe. Yeah. Which compared to 6,000, maybe I can give up a little bit of sound,
Right. Exactly. And that's the thing too. And that comes part to the practice as well. It's like, there could be anything that distracts you from your float. And part of it is like, again, just letting it go. Yeah. So if you hear a little clink or something, are you going to let that pull you out of the whole thing? Or are you just going to kind of like, okay, there it was, but just let it go and get right back into it. You practice the art of letting go of everything. So even if there is a little sound or a little distraction, don't let it ruin your whole float. And we'll get that sometimes with people that are struggling with the tank. They'll get out and be like, yeah, I got water in my eye. Yeah, that's going to happen. You're in a pool, like, you float enough, it's going to happen. But are you going to let that ruin your experience, or are you going to, just say, oh, it can happen, and it happened. But, so you got to just kind of, you got to work with it as well a little bit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, let's see. The other thing I was going to touch on was that, like people I've heard stories of people who, as we talk about like the psychedelic experience compared to the tank experience, people have talked about how, if they are maybe already practiced at meditation, like obviously what you're saying there kind of refers to the fact that it's a skill. You kind of learn to get better at letting these things go and being in that meditative state. And people who are maybe very good with this kind of thing talk about really with no psychedelic added reaching these very psychedelic states of mind, like having sort of visual hallucinations, having visions, and seeing, I don't know, getting to levels similar to something like ayahuasca could bring you. I wonder what's your experience with that, and do you believe that that's actually like that kind of thing is possible at that level?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it really depends on the person, For myself, I've had tremendously intense experiences in the tank just with me, and nothing else. One of my most potent ones was actually I had the privilege of being able to go to Eckhart Tolle speak in Vancouver here, and then I went for a float right after that, and he was like a little psychedelic on his own, just hearing him talk with the discourse that he delivers, and then getting to go and float with that was one of my best floats ever. And then, I've heard of a lot of different stories from people who have had really intense experiences and very paranormal experiences and visionary type experiences in the tank. And so it's totally possible, but, I wouldn't say that is the norm. I wouldn't say that's so if people are going in there expecting to have like a mushroom trip, it's probably not going to happen. And in fact, it's best to go in with no expectations at all, and just kind of let yourself go in and see what happens, and go with it. So it's not but it is possible to have very vivid lucid dreams, different types of visuals. And the one guy that works for us, he did a really cool experience last year. He, I think, floated for 30 plus days straight. And that seems to be a triggering mechanism, like floating every day.
Okay. He did get out of the tank during.
Oh yeah, no, he float. Do a 90-minute float once for 30 days. So floating every day for 30 days, not all day, but every day. And that seems to really. I've never done an everyday practice for much longer than 3 or 4 or 5 days, I'd say. When I first got the tank, I was floating every other day for about 6 weeks, and that was really, really awesome. Like really deep experiences there. But so I think there is something to floating a lot, and then also, but then going into longer floats as well, going into a 3.5 hour, 4 hour, 6 hour float is going to be, I don't know, it forces another layer, another level of surrendering, because you kind of have to decide like, I'm going in here for half the day and I'm just going to see what happens. And I'm choosing to stay in, and just staying in for longer periods of time does seem to compound the effects of the float tank, both physically, mentally, and then also kind of like experientially, I find.
Right. Yeah, it's very much like a tool for meditation is what it sounds like. Like it's just a tool you can use to heighten that experience. And like you mentioned before, you could also, like people traditionally would like go into a cave or something where it is dark, and maybe fast as well. Like fasting seems like another tool that people use for these meditative practices to help just initiate those sort of those visions and those thoughts coming along. Yeah,
and there's lots of different levels and extreme approaches that will have different and unique results. For example, like Vipassana meditation. Have you heard of Vipassana meditation?
I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar.
So like a Vipassana retreat is typically a 10-day retreat that you get to go to, and it's silent. There's no speaking.
Okay. Yeah. I know someone who attended one of those. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's lots of other covets to it. Like there's no reading, no writing, no listening to music, no exercising. You're allowed to walk, but then you're just meditating for like 12 hours a day, like in broken up sessions, and listening to some discourse at night about the meditation, and just doing that for 10 days, eating very simple meals, and just kind of, so it's another form of isolation. It's more like cultural isolation, and anything like that, floating, meditation, what they start to do is they start to de-automatize us. They take us out of our automatization modes, our pattern modes. Like seems like everything in the living world and non-living world is all patternistic. And so when we can kind of break those patterns, that's where we kind of can realize the more simple things in life that we constantly kind of gloss over because it's too much to look at. And so we just look at the things we need to look at. It's probably an evolutionary, trait really, but it's nice to be able to shake up that snow globe a little bit and to see habits, like you don't need to kind of just go day by day in those routines. That's when you need to do some sort of practice that shakes it up. It de-automatizes you so you can just get out of those things, because we learn patternistically. We're very patterned.
Yeah, it's true.
We're creatures of habit, right?
Yeah, no, I spoke to someone, First Nation, a guy I did a sweat lodge with. He was leading the ceremony, and he also works for like traditional based addiction camp for men who have addictions. And one thing he mentioned that I really liked was like, if you want to stop being addicted to something, if you want to make a big change in your life and stop drinking alcohol or stop smoking a cigarette, first just change something else. Like we do everything on automatic, like you said. And he's like, just brush your teeth with your left hand one day. Just do that. Like make a little change that throws you out of your automatic this and this and this and your habitual routine. And just by breaking that can lead to huge changes as well.
Yeah, it just seems to open you up, kind of, like take a different drive to work or something, or walk a different way or whatever, like anything to kind of like just get you out of those patterns, is a really good practice. And then that's why I like floating, because it's like such an extreme form of that. We take everything away for 90 minutes for this very potent experience of nothing. And then you come out and you are hypersensitive.
Right.
You're de-automatized. So it's very effective doing that.
Yeah, I'm even more interested in floating now after this discussion. So yeah, thanks a lot for talking to me. I'm kind of bummed that you didn't have like a, $500 solution to build my own tank, but that's all right.
It doesn't exist, man, to be honest with you. And that's just being real. I'm not just I'm an owner of a commercial float center, but looking at it objectively, I think having a center you can go to that is designed ideally for that experience in terms of a set and setting, and where you don't have to deal with any of the maintenance of it. To be honest, that seems like a dream for me right now.
Yeah. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, there's so much to it, and so it's nice to be able to just go pay $40, float for 90 minutes and leave. And that's the value of like a float center in my mind for people, because the cost and the time it takes to maintain it, it's not that it's not worth it, but it's just like, it's a lot of extra work. And for $40, you can go and have that yourself.
Right.
So, but, and it'll take time. Like floating is still growing. You're going to see it, get populated in the major cities first, and then surrounding areas, and it will reach everywhere eventually. Like it's that legitimate, in my opinion, of a therapeutic modality that it has validity to occur in every community. For all the reasons we talked about today.
Right. So maybe we can end with you just letting people know how they can find your float houses. I know you've sort of expanded to different areas now. You've got multiple things going on, and how they can get in touch with you personally, maybe if they want to.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm on Facebook as Mike Zaremba. You can just find my profile there. And our website for Floathouse is floathouse.ca. We have all the links there to all of our locations, which is all throughout the Lower Mainland now, and actually one more now in Edmonton.
Okay. That's closer to me. Maybe I'll have to look into that one.
Yeah. And then, and if you want to use the promo code RECOVERY, you can save 20% off a single float. And also our podcast that my brother and I do is called Vancouver Real, and it is on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and YouTube. So it's Vancouver Real, REAL. And that's a podcast we do about weekly, bi-weekly out of Floathouse, actually. So we have a lot of the same topics, but we also kind of just get into things that our guests are a part of as well. So
right. Yeah. And I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts too, I'll just mention. And I definitely recommend people check them out. Especially, I feel the one with Gabor Mate really speaks to a lot of the stuff that I talk about on this one. And I really thought that was a great one. So
thank you.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks for talking to me.
All right. Thanks, Carl. Appreciate it.